They thought I was just another nobody. Another drifter passing through. Someone they could push around for fun. Big mistake. Name's Ethan Graves, 55, and I've seen my fair share of rough towns and bad cops. But this place? This was something else. A small town in Tennessee. The kind where everybody knows everybody and outsiders stick out like a sore thumb. I was here to take up the badge as chief of police. But before I could even set foot in the station, I got my first introduction to the way things worked around here. And let me tell you, it wasn't pretty. I had just arrived the night before, kept a low profile, and figured I'd take a walk through town early in the morning, see what I was dealing with. No badge, no uniform, just a worn-out baseball cap and an old jacket. A stranger on the street. I wanted to see this town before it saw me. Didn't take long to realize something was off. Locals gave me side glances, the kind that said, "You don't belong here." A few folks even muttered under their breath as I passed. But the real welcome committee, that came in the form of Deputy Roy Carter and Deputy Hank Lawson. Two cops, who looked like they had been running this town like their own little kingdom for years. I spotted them outside a local diner, leaning against their squad car, laughing about something like they didn't have a care in the world. Then, their eyes landed on me. Roy, the tall one with the cocky grin, nudged Hank, who was built like a linebacker and twice as mean looking. I could see the moment they decided I was fair game. They let me walk a little farther down the street before I heard the siren chirp behind me. "Hey, old-timer," Roy called out. "You lost? 'Cause you sure don't look local." I stopped but kept my face blank. "Just passing through," I said, keeping my voice calm. Hank chuckled. "Yeah? 'Cause around here, strangers don't just pass through without saying hi to the welcoming committee." Before I could answer, they stepped out of the car and closed in. Too close. I could smell the coffee on Roy's breath as he smirked. "Let's see what you got in those pockets, pal." I didn't flinch. I'd seen this play before, cops with too much power and too little oversight. But I wasn't about to give them the reaction they wanted. Roy patted me down like he was searching for buried treasure, then pulled out my wallet, flipping through it with exaggerated interest. Well, what do we have here?" He held up an old receipt like it was some damning evidence. "Looks mighty suspicious to me." Hank grinned. "You know what, Roy? I think we ought to show our friend here how we treat strangers who don't follow the rules." And just like that, they each grabbed an arm and dragged me down Main Street like I was some troublemaker caught red-handed. No questions. No explanation. Just pure humiliation. People stopped and stared, some whispering, some chuckling. A few even pulled out their phones, recording like this was the best entertainment they'd had all week. Roy made a big show of it, announcing to the crowd, "Ladies and gentlemen, we got ourselves a real city slicker here. Thinks he can just waltz into our town without so much as a proper introduction." Before I knew it, they had me tied to a lamppost right in the middle of the town square, hands secured behind my back with a zip tie. More laughter. More phones recording. I took a deep breath, keeping my expression unreadable. Let them have their fun. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Not yet. But by the time this was over, they'd wish they'd never met me. They thought they were in control. Standing there, tied to that lamppost like some kind of town joke, I could see Roy Carter and Hank Lawson basking in the attention. They strutted around, cracking jokes, soaking up the laughter from the townsfolk like it was just another morning in their little kingdom. But they had no idea that their time was up, and I was going to enjoy every second of watching them figure it out. The next morning, I walked into the sheriff's station like I owned the place. Because, well, I did. The moment I stepped through those doors, I could feel the tension shift in the air. The deputies at their desks looked up, expecting to see just another citizen walking in with a complaint. Instead, they saw a man who had been humiliated in the middle of town less than 24 hours ago, but this time, I wasn't some random stranger. I was wearing my uniform. My badge gleamed under the station lights, and my name tag read Sheriff Ethan Graves. That got their attention. A few officers exchanged glances, some with dawning realization, others with sheer panic. No one had told them. No one had warned them. Roy and Hank had dragged their own boss through the dirt, and they had no idea. I strode past them, heading straight for the main briefing room, where the morning shift was gathering. I wanted an audience for this. And right on cue, the dynamic duo came waltzing in, laughing about something like they had just won the lottery. They hadn't even bothered to check the news, hadn't even considered that their little stunt might have blown up beyond their control. Then Roy saw me. The laughter died in his throat so fast you'd think he got punched in the gut. His face paled, his smirk frozen mid-grin as he stared at my uniform. Hank followed his gaze, his brows furrowing at first, then shooting up as if someone had just dumped a bucket of ice water over his head. I let the silence stretch, let them squirm under the weight of it. All eyes were on me now. Finally, I spoke, my voice calm, steady, cold. Well, gentlemen, looks like we've got ourselves a situation. The room was dead silent. I took a step forward, locking eyes with Roy first. I assume you both recognize me? He opened his mouth, then shut it. Hank just stared, like his brain was still catching up to reality. I pulled out my phone, tapped the screen, and let the video play. Their own voices filled the room, every mocking word, every joke, every smug laugh as they dragged me through town and tied me up for sport. A few officers shifted uncomfortably. Others looked disgusted. I turned the volume up. The video showed Roy sneering into the camera, bragging about how they taught outsiders a lesson. Then I hit pause. Silence. I let my gaze sweep across the room. Anyone here confused about what went down? I asked. Because if you are, I'd be more than happy to play it again. Roy finally found his voice, his hands clenching at his sides. Sheriff, look, this was just a little town tradition, you know? I cut him off with a raised hand. Tradition? My voice was sharp now. So, tell me, Roy, how many people have you done this to before? His jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. How many people have you humiliated in this town just because you felt like it? I turned to Hank. How many folks were too scared to say anything, because you two made sure they knew who was in charge? Hank looked down. Roy stood his ground, though I could see the sweat forming on his brow. Then he tried to play tough. He squared his shoulders and smirked, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. Look, Sheriff, he said, voice forced and cocky. This is how we do things around here. Keeps people in line. Just a little fun. I stepped closer, voice low and sharp. So you're telling me that publicly humiliating people, tying them up like criminals for the whole town to laugh at, that's your idea of fun? His smirk faltered. No one got hurt, he muttered. I nodded slowly. Then I reached into my pocket, pulled out 2 termination forms, signed them, held them up for the whole room to see. Well, Roy, Hank, you're about to find out what happens when no one gets hurt. The room stayed dead silent as I placed the papers on the desk between them. Hand over your badges. Neither of them moved at first. The weight of the moment crashed down on them hard. Finally, Hank was the first to break. He pulled his badge off, looking like he wanted to punch a hole in the wall, and slammed it onto the desk. Roy, he hesitated. His jaw clenched, his fists tight. For a second, I thought he was going to say something, try to weasel his way out of it. But then his hands went to his chest. And slowly, he unpinned his badge. The sound of it clinking on the desk was the only sound in the room. I picked them up, pocketed them, and looked around at the other officers. This is how it's gonna be from now on, I said, voice steady, leaving no room for argument. From today forward, we serve this town with respect, with integrity. And if anyone here thinks they can't handle that, I patted the pocket holding their badges. You know where to find me. I watched as Roy and Hank walked out, their shoulders stiff, their faces set in stone. They thought they ran this town. They thought they could do whatever they wanted. But now, they were just 2 ex-cops who had just learned a lesson they'd never forget. And trust me, this was only the beginning. Roy and Hank thought they could walk away from this. They thought they could spin it, control the damage, maybe even smooth things over with the right people. They couldn't have been more wrong. By the next morning, their little stunt wasn't just town gossip anymore. It was everywhere. It started small. A few locals had posted the video on social media. The one where Roy and Hank dragged me through town, tied me to a lamppost, and put on a show like I was some street performer for their entertainment. At first, the comments were just from people in town. Some thought it was funny. Others thought it was just another day in a place where the deputies did whatever they pleased. Then, outsiders started noticing. People from other counties, other states, they saw the video, and they weren't laughing. What the hell is this? These guys are actual law enforcement? This looks like something out of the damn Wild West. The outrage spread like wildfire. By noon, news stations were calling. By nightfall, reporters were in town. By the next morning, this little backwater town was the center of a national scandal. I stepped out of my office that day and was immediately hit with a wall of reporters. Cameras flashing. Mics being shoved in my face. Voices talking over each other. Sheriff Graves, did you know these deputies before taking the job? Sheriff, are you pressing charges? What kind of department are you running here? Do you believe this town has a history of corruption? I raised a hand, letting the noise die down. Then I spoke. Let's get one thing clear. My voice was calm, controlled. What you saw in that video is exactly what it looks like: two deputies who thought they were above the law. They're no longer with this department. And I can assure you, this kind of behavior will never happen again under my watch. The questions kept coming, but I didn't stay long. I knew this wasn't just about what I had to say. It was about what the people of this town were going to do next. And believe me, they were done staying quiet. That afternoon, the protests started. It began with just a handful of people. A few locals holding signs in front of the sheriff's office, calling for justice, demanding answers. Then the crowd grew. By sundown, there were hundreds. People who had never dared to speak out before were finding their voices. I stood at the station window, watching as they chanted, as they held up their phones, recording every second, making sure the world was still watching. One sign caught my eye. No more corruption. No more fear. That was when I knew this wasn't just about me anymore. As the protests raged, more stories came out. People started talking, really talking. A woman stepped forward, telling a reporter about how Roy once pulled over her teenage son for no reason, searched his car, and threatened to throw him in jail unless he showed some respect. An older man admitted that Hank used to shake down small businesses for protection money. One by one, the town's dirty secrets started pouring out. Roy and Hank weren't just a couple of bad apples, they were the tip of the iceberg. This department had been rotten for years. Then came the phone call. It was from the state attorney general's office. Sheriff Graves, we're launching an official investigation into your department. Effective immediately. I expected this. Hell, I wanted this. Do what you need to do, I told them. I'll cooperate fully. Because if there was one thing I knew for sure, it was this: Roy and Hank were just the beginning. This town had a reckoning coming. And I was going to make sure every last one of them faced it. The protests hadn't died down. If anything, they were getting louder. What started as anger over one incident had turned into a full-blown movement. People weren't just calling for justice against Roy and Hank anymore. They wanted the whole damn system cleaned out. And I was going to give them exactly that. The state investigators arrived in town just 2 days after I got the call. They didn't come quietly. 4 black SUVs rolled up to the sheriff's office, and out stepped a team of state bureau agents, led by a hard-faced woman named Special Investigator Dana Holloway. She didn't waste time. Sheriff Graves, she said, shaking my hand. This department is officially under investigation. We'll need full access to records, case files, and personnel reports dating back at least 10 years. I nodded. You'll have everything you need. She studied me for a moment, then gave a small nod. Good. Because from what we've seen so far, this place is rotten to the core. She had no idea how right she was. The deeper we dug, the worse it got. Turns out, Roy and Hank weren't just bullies, they were criminals. Over the years, they had falsified police reports to justify bogus arrests, shaken down small business owners for protection fees, threatened and intimidated witnesses who tried to speak out, took bribes to look the other way on illegal activities. But that was just the beginning. Because the real bombshell was sitting in the department's old case files. One night, I sat in my office, going through arrest records with Investigator Holloway. I flipped through an old report. The name caught my eye. Miguel Alvarez. The file said Miguel had been arrested 5 years ago for resisting an officer and assault on a law enforcement official. But something was off. His mugshot showed a black eye, a busted lip, and bruises all over his face. The report claimed he fell while resisting arrest. I looked at Holloway. You buying this? She scoffed. Not a damn chance. We started cross-referencing cases. And that's when we found the pattern. Miguel wasn't the only one. Dozens of cases. Same charges. Same injuries. Same excuse, fell while resisting arrest. Every single one of them involved Roy, Hank, or their close buddies. This wasn't just corruption. This was systematic abuse. By the end of the week, witnesses started coming forward. One by one, people walked into my office, some angry, some scared, all with stories to tell. A young woman told us how Roy once pulled her over for reckless driving and wouldn't let her go unless she thanked him properly. A store owner said, Hank used to stop by every month for a donation to keep his business from getting mysteriously vandalized. Then came Miguel Alvarez himself. He sat across from me, his hands clenched into fists. You know what my real crime was, Sheriff? He asked. I told Roy Carter the first wouldn't give him free car repairs anymore. That's all it took. That's all it took for him to end up in the hospital, with a broken rib and a felony charge. By the time Holloway and her team finished their audit, the evidence was overwhelming. Over 100 false arrests. Over $200,000 in illegal payments extorted from businesses. And at least 12 officers in this department were in on it. I wasn't cleaning up a few bad apples. I was burning the whole damn orchard down. The final nail in the coffin. The FBI got involved. When they saw the extent of the corruption, they expanded the investigation to include county officials, judges, and even a former mayor. This town wasn't just broken. It had been rigged from the top down. And now, it was all coming crashing down. The night before the arrests, I walked through town. The protests were still going. People held signs. They chanted. But there was something different in the air now. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was hope. For the first time in a long time, the people in this town believed justice was coming. And the next morning, they were right. The courtroom was packed. Every seat filled. Every wall lined with people who had waited years for this moment. It wasn't just about Roy Carter and Hank Lawson anymore. It was about every corrupt cop, every crooked official, every injustice that had been swept under the rug for far too long. And today, justice was finally knocking at their door. The state attorney led the prosecution. Roy and Hank sat at the defense table, looking like two men who had just realized they weren't untouchable anymore. No smug grins, no cocky attitude. Just two ex-deputies who knew they were screwed. Their lawyer, a high-priced defense attorney paid for by some deep pockets in town, tried to paint them as dedicated officers just following small-town traditions. But the evidence? It spoke louder than any excuse they could come up with. The first witness was Miguel Alvarez. He took the stand, gripping the railing so tightly his knuckles went white. Roy Carter beat me within an inch of my life, he said, his voice shaking. Then he threw me in jail for fighting back. Roy wouldn't even look at him. Then came business owners who had been forced to pay protection fees. Then young men and women who had been bullied, threatened, and falsely arrested. Then came the video. The one that started it all. The courtroom fell silent as the footage played on the big screen. Roy and Hank, strutting through town, dragging me like a prize they had won. The laughter. The taunts. The zip ties around my wrists. I watched their faces as they relived it. They knew, in that moment, there was no way out. Then it was my turn to take the stand. The prosecutor walked up. Sheriff Graves, in your professional opinion, what kind of officers were Roy Carter and Hank Lawson? I looked straight at them when I answered. The kind that disgraces the badge. Roy flinched. Hank looked down. They were bullies, I continued. They used their power to intimidate, humiliate, and control this town. But the truth is, they weren't just bad cops, they were criminals. And today, they're finally facing what they deserve. Their lawyer tried one last desperate move. Your Honor, my clients were simply enforcing the law in their own way. The judge shut him down before he could even finish. Enforcing the law? By humiliating innocent civilians? By extorting business owners? By fabricating charges? He shook his head. Enough. This trial isn't about tradition, it's about accountability. And I've heard more than enough. Then came the verdict. Roy Carter and Hank Lawson, on the charges of false imprisonment, assault under the color of authority, conspiracy, and extortion. The judge looked over the courtroom, at the faces of the people who had suffered under these two men. Then he slammed his gavel down. Guilty, on all counts. The courtroom erupted. Some people cheered. Some people cried. But everyone felt the same thing. For the first time in years, this town had justice. As Roy and Hank were led away in handcuffs, Roy finally snapped. He turned back to me, eyes burning with hatred. "You think you won?" He spat. "You think this town is gonna change just because you got rid of me?" I stepped forward, looking him in the eye. "No, Roy," I said calmly. "I think this town is gonna change, because people like you aren't running it anymore." He had no comeback for that. The door slammed shut behind him. And just like that, the reign of Roy Carter and Hank Lawson was over. Outside the courthouse, the crowd was waiting. As soon as I stepped out, a cheer rose up. People clapped me on the back, shook my hand, thanked me. But I wasn't the one who deserved the thanks. This wasn't about me. This was about them. The people who had stood up. The people who had spoken out. The people who had demanded justice, and finally got it. As I looked out at the crowd, I knew one thing for sure. This town would never be the same again. For the first time in years, the town felt different. The fear that once lurked in the shadows, the unspoken rules that kept people in line, the unchecked power of men like Roy Carter and Hank Lawson, it was all gone. But that didn't mean the fight was over. Because tearing down corruption? That's only half the job. The real challenge? Building something better in its place. The cleanup begins. The first thing I did as sheriff of this town, my town now, was clean house. Roy and Hank weren't the only ones who had abused their badges. The State Bureau's investigation uncovered a dozen more deputies who had looked the other way, covered up evidence, or even taken part in the corruption. So I called a meeting. The entire department sat in the briefing room, tension thick in the air. I stood in front of them, held up a stack of pink slips, and read out every single name. Some tried to argue. Some stormed out, slamming doors behind them. But most just sat there, heads down, knowing this was a long time coming. By the time I was done, half the department was gone. And honestly, good riddance. This town didn't need cops who ruled with fear. It needed officers who served with integrity. Rebuilding trust. Cleaning up the department was one thing. Winning back the town's trust? That was another. For too long, people here had seen law enforcement as the enemy. I had to change that. So I made a promise, not in a press conference, not in some staged event, but right there in the streets where people could look me in the eye. No more secrets. No more cover-ups. If a cop in this town abuses their power, they won't get a slap on the wrist, they'll be out the door and in handcuffs. It wasn't just words. I walked the streets every day, talking to business owners, listening to complaints, letting people see that the sheriff's office belonged to them again. I wasn't here to control this town. I was here to protect it. And slowly, they started to believe me. Justice for the victims. While I was busy fixing the department, the courts were busy delivering justice. Lawsuits started rolling in. The business owners Roy and Hank extorted, they got their money back and then some. The people falsely arrested, their records were wiped clean. And the biggest win of all? The judge announced that any case built on Roy and Hank's testimony was officially under review. That meant dozens of people who had been wrongfully convicted finally had a shot at freedom. That was real justice. Not just punishing the guilty, but making things right for the innocent. The town stands up. Something incredible happened in the weeks after the trial. People who had never spoken up before started finding their voices. Town hall meetings went from empty rooms to packed houses where people actually cared about what was happening. Instead of living in fear, they started holding their leaders accountable. Instead of whispering about injustice, they demanded change. For the first time in a long time, this town belonged to its people again. And that's what real change looks like. Final showdown, but of course, not everyone was happy. See, corruption runs deep. And when you take down the ones in power, the people who put them there start getting nervous. One night, after closing up the station, I walked out to find a black SUV parked across the street. Windows tinted. Engine running. The kind of car that doesn't belong in a small town like this. A second later, a man stepped out. Slick suit. Expensive shoes. The kind of guy who never gets his hands dirty, but always knows where the dirt is buried. He smiled at me, but it wasn't friendly. "Sheriff Graves," he said, "you've made a lot of noise. A lot of people aren't happy about that." I folded my arms. "Yeah? And?" He sighed. like he was talking to someone too dumb to take a hint. Guys like Roy and Hank, they were small fish. There are bigger players in this game, Sheriff. And you don't want to pick a fight you can't win. I took a step closer, lowering my voice just enough to make sure he heard me. I don't pick fights. I let that sink in before I added, but I sure as hell finish them. The smile dropped from his face. He got back in the SUV and drove off. But I knew what that was. A warning. A reminder that this fight wasn't over. And that was fine by me. Because as long as I was sheriff of this town, I had one job: make sure men like him never win again. A new beginning. The next morning, I walked outside to find the town waking up to something new. The air felt lighter. The people stood taller. Because for the first time in a long time, this wasn't a town ruled by fear. This was a town with a future. And as long as I was breathing, I'd make damn sure it stayed that way. For too long, people in that town lived in fear, accepting corruption, injustice, and abuse because they believed nothing could change. But one thing this story teaches us is that change is always possible when people have the courage to stand up. It only took one moment of truth, one video going viral, one person saying enough to set off a chain reaction that gave the town its power back. The same applies to life. Whether it's standing up to a bully, speaking out against injustice, or simply refusing to stay silent when something feels wrong, our voices matter. For many older Americans, we've seen history repeat itself. We've seen corruption in politics, unfair treatment in our own communities, and moments where good people suffered because no one held the powerful accountable. But the lesson here is clear: it's never too late to fight for what's right. Justice may take time, and the battle may not be easy, but in the end, the truth always rises to the surface. And when people come together for a common cause, real change happens. Never underestimate the power of one voice, one stand, one moment of courage. This story is more than just about taking down corrupt cops. It's about restoring justice, rebuilding trust, and proving that no one is above the law. It's a reminder that doing the right thing isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. If this story resonated with you, leave a like and subscribe to join us in sharing powerful stories about justice, resilience, and the triumph of truth.